Suitcase without handle. Nastya had a love, but it ended. In her youth, she fell in love with her classmate Ignat, waited for him to leave the army and married him. But their fate did not work out. Ignat fell ill with a serious blood disease and died just 3 months after the wedding. Nastya took care of him when he was ill, and then grieved for a long time. She has never been able to find another man. The parents were unhappy. They wanted grandchildren, but Nastya didn't want to give birth to just anyone. All she needed was Ignat. It's been 10 years since his death, her mother told her. It's time to think about your female happiness and start a family. Later, Mom Nastya replied, but she herself thought that happiness could be not only in family, but also in work. By this time, she had already graduated from the Faculty of Journalism and had become a sought-after specialist in this field. In addition, she ran a blog, and her work in this field was also successful, as her subscribers actively expressed their support. Nastya traveled a lot around the country and the world, actively wrote, and it was certainly emotionally exhausting. She needed a way to regain her strength, and she quickly found it. Nastya bought a country house. It was small but cozy, with a beautiful garden and a small vegetable garden. There were also 3 apple trees, 2 plums, yellow and blue, a cherry and bushes of gooseberries, raspberries, and black currants. It was a beautiful garden. Her parents' house was nearby, and her father helped Nastya take care of her manor, as she jokingly called her country house. She had a strained relationship with her mother ever since she decided not to have children, and the women tried to avoid meetings unnecessarily. During the summer season, Nastya moved to the country, and the rest of the time she went on trips to collect materials for her articles. She had a good internet connection at her cottage, and she spent her time tending plants and processing her journalistic materials. She had no friends, and she suddenly felt lonely. Although there were many people in the village, they were all couples, and Nastya missed the male attention. She even started having dreams about love and men. In one dream, she came to a dance where all the girls were with partners, and she was standing alone in a corner. In another dream, she arrived in an unfamiliar city, and all the women were meeting their husbands, and she was dragging a heavy suitcase. And the suitcase didn't have a handle. Suddenly, she saw Ignat in a railway worker's uniform on the platform. She was delighted and asked him to help her with her suitcase. "I can't," he says. "I can't help you, I'm on duty. Ask someone else." "But I don't want to live with anyone, just you," Nastya burst into tears. "Don't live with anyone, just let them help you with your suitcase." Ignat smiled at her and disappeared, disappearing into thin air as if he had never existed. Nastya woke up in tears. Why is life so unfair sometimes? Even with her husband alive, someone is wagging her tail, looking to the side, but Nastya cannot forget her Ignat, remains faithful to him. The next day, a neighbor, an elderly woman, came to Nastya and asked her to take her blood pressure. "My device is malfunctioning, the pressure is too low," she explained. Nastya's father also has blood pressure spikes sometimes, so she has been keeping a blood pressure monitor at the cottage for a long time, just in case. They measured the pressure again, but Nastya's device also showed too low pressure. "I'm calling an ambulance," Nastya said. "Well, call, there's neighbor Lyasha coming, he'll meet their car at the turn," the neighbor said and called out to a young man who was passing by. While Nastya was dialing the ambulance number, the neighbor was talking to Lyasha. "Lyasha, where are all of yours? What is it?" she asked. "They went to visit someone in the city," he replied. Then Lyasha went to meet the ambulance, and Nastya slowly followed him along the road with her grandmother. Something's wrong with Leshka and his wife, he didn't even go to town with her, the neighbor muttered to herself. Lyasha met an ambulance, the doctors examined the neighbor and took her to the hospital. Lyasha and Nastya helped her pack up and close the house. Finally, they saw Grandma off and breathed a sigh of relief. It was so hot that I couldn't breathe. Why don't we go to the lake and swim? Lyasha suggested. Let's go for a swim, Nastya agreed. The evening turned out to be hot, but at the same time calm and beautiful. The water in the lake was very warm. Nastya lay on her back and swam along the thickets of sedge and reeds. Suddenly, a huge swan jumped out of the coastal bushes and flapped its wings at the floating Nastya. She screamed and hurried back to the shore. But the swan was already upon her. Fortunately, Lyasha came to the rescue, and the swan fell behind. He's probably guarding his nest here, Nastya whispered. Probably, Lyasha nodded, admiring Nastya. Nastya didn't even notice how she grabbed Lyasha by the neck when they were running away from the angry bird. Somehow, it turned out that Lyasha gently kissed Nastya on the lips. She didn't want to, but she gave in. Then they walked along a narrow path to the cottages. If you want, you can come to my place, Nastya offered, surprised at her own boldness. But Lyasha was very glad of her invitation and spent the whole night with Nastya, and in the morning he went to his dacha. That's how their romance began in the country, and since then Alexei began to visit Nastya regularly, especially after conflicts with his wife. She made scandals for him, and he, in upset feelings, ran away to his mistress. Nastya was fine too. She did not seek a new relationship, but a temporary relationship with Alexei suited her. Ignat, in a dream, advised her to help with the suitcase, and Alexei began to help her. Now Ludmila knew for sure that her husband was unfaithful to her. At first, she only felt it, but then she began to notice betrayal by subtle signs. For example, there was a strange scent coming from his hair, but she dismissed the thought. No, of course not. So that her Lyasha, Lyosenka, would cheat on her? It's impossible. Then she noticed a long blonde hair on his clothes, but she waved it away again. You never know, maybe he was standing in line at the checkout or giving someone a ride home from work. But doubt nevertheless crept into Ludmila's soul, and she began to take a closer look at her husband. She noticed that after their quarrels, he began to take offense and leave the house for the night. Where were you all night? She asked him in the morning. I was walking, Alexei replied dryly. In the past, Ludmila often made scenes for her husband. She could slap him in the face for any reason. It was his fault, of course. Oh, you so and so, everyone's husbands are like husbands, and you're just a slacker and a mumbler, etc. Alexei used to be patient and even apologized. Ludmila knew she was overreacting, but she couldn't help herself. Where will he go? They met at school. Alexei was crazy about Ludmila and sought her attention for a long time. And she was the most beautiful girl in school and was waiting for a better match than Alexei. As often happens with beautiful girls, the guys were afraid to mess with her, so Ludmila was left alone. Well, if you didn't find it at school, you'll find it at college or at work. But there were no worthy gentlemen there either. While Ludmila was choosing, all the more or less suitable guys were sorted out, and just then Lyasha returned from the army. He matured, got stronger, and started working in his father's business. Ludmila, let's go to the cinema. Ludmila, let's go to a restaurant. How can I refuse, especially if no one else offers? Ludmila got used to the fact that Lyasha is always there, always ready to help and endure any insults. Got married. 2 children. At the beginning of family life, everything was fine, but then Ludmila began to behave aggressively and snap at Lyasha for any reason and without him. He endured, and then began to move away from her, spending less time at home and justifying himself by being busy at work. Then they bought a cottage, and Alexei threw himself into building a house and landscaping the site. He did everything with his own hands, and the cottage turned out to be wonderful. But Ludmila continued to express dissatisfaction and make scandals. Alexei was annoyed by this. He certainly wasn't thinking about getting a divorce. How can you leave Luda with 2 children? No way. When her husband began to move away from the family and go for a walk after quarrels, Ludmila changed her behavior. She realized that her husband could leave altogether, and she felt sorry to lose such a man who built a cottage and paid off the mortgage, and the family was not in trouble with him. Ludmila stopped brawling and thought about it. But it was too late. Now Alexei himself provoked his wife to quarrel. He said unpleasant things to her and did something wrong. He knew all her weaknesses and knew how to piss her off. Ludmila would break down again and start screaming. How can you resist if you're hitting a sore spot? Besides, she had a long-standing habit of not holding back in front of her husband. And it was only to Alexei's advantage. He frowned, slammed the door and left until morning. Ludmila decided to follow her husband. She wanted to know where he went. Alexei ran through the bushes and disappeared through the gate of a neighboring house. Ludmila was furious. She wanted to break into this girl's house and make a scene. But she restrained herself and returned to the cottage. Ludmila ruined her own happiness. She pushed her husband to commit adultery. Now he has stopped sleeping in the bedroom and spends his evenings in the living room watching TV. Ludmila, on the other hand, suffers alone on a large marital bed. She can't approach her husband first, her pride won't let her. It turned out that Alexei started running to Nastya, a nondescript blogger. I'll take revenge on you, Ludmila thought and began to plot an insidious plan. Igor Timofeev, their neighbor in the country, had long been paying attention to Ludmila. She didn't make a scene for her husband, but decided to cheat on him with Igor. The main thing is to keep your pride, and then let Lushenka continue to cheat on her. If he doesn't stop, she'll cheat on him too. A few days later, the opportunity presented itself to carry out his plans. That evening, they had a big fight with Alexei again, and he, offended, went to his Nastya. There were no children at the cottage, they were taken in by their grandparents. Ludmila sat down on a bench and began to look at the starry sky. Suddenly, something flashed, and a star fell. What a beauty! In August, stars often fall from the sky, and Ludmila made a wish, let everything be fair. Hello, neighbor, a man's voice called from a nearby cottage. Are you counting the stars? It was Igor, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Yes, Luda nodded and added sadly, what else can a single woman do? Since when have you been single? Igor asked with a slight swagger in his voice. What about your husband? My husband left, Luda replied. Igor jumped over the fence. Did he really leave? What is it? He asked, sitting down next to Ludmila on a bench. Yeah, he left and ran off to look for new pairs, she grinned. And you're alone here, sad and longing, the neighbor either asked or stated. He didn't let her answer, covered her lips with a kiss, picked her up in his arms and carried her into the house. Igor was a strong and sturdy man. Everyone knows that there are no former paratroopers, but he served in the paratroopers for several years and only recently retired. Perhaps Ludmila could have escaped punishment for her revenge, and Alexei would not have found out anything. But it was on this day that Nastya left the cottage for the city, and he kissed the lock on the gate and wandered back to his room. And there Ludmila was already taking revenge on him with Igor. Alexei did not come into conflict with an experienced paratrooper, and he did not want to quarrel over Ludmila. Apparently, he had fallen out of love with her for a long time, and even their sighs and groans coming from the bedroom did not cause him any emotions. He didn't chase them away, but just lay down on the sofa in the living room and fell asleep until morning. Ludmila was shocked when she saw him. "I know everything," Alexei said calmly at breakfast. "Pack your things and leave. You can file for divorce yourself, or I will." "Lyasha, aren't you ashamed?" Ludmila shook her head. "You run to Nastya yourself. I'm one thing, and you're another." Alexei grinned. "You knew about my infidelities, but you tolerated them, and I do not intend to tolerate my wife's infidelity. Don't worry, you and the kids will have the apartment, but I won't give the cottage to anyone." No matter how Ludmila tried to persuade him, Alexei did not agree to live with her anymore. They divorced after a while. The children stayed with Ludmila, and Alexei arranged meetings with them on Saturdays. "Nastya, let's get married," he suggested. "And we'll have a baby." "I don't want to." Nastya shook her head. "And how to live now?" Lyasha scratched his head. "The same as before," Nastya replied. "You're at your dacha, I'm at mine. Only now you can come to me openly, and not through the bushes." Of course, Nastya has a job, business trips, she is used to a lonely life, she does not need a family. And Lyasha fell in love with her, he's crazy about this girl. What to do? Nothing. He decided to leave it as it was and wait. Maybe Nastya will change her mind. It's one thing when you live paycheck to paycheck and are happy if you have enough money to pay for utilities and food for yourself and your family. Losing such a job is not a big deal, because you can find a similar job somewhere nearby. Of course, it's a pity if the company you worked for many years suddenly went bankrupt, but it's not fatal, because you won't be out of work thanks to your skills and abilities. And what does it feel like for the head and owner of a bankrupt company? After all, this man probably started his business from scratch, this is his brainchild. And now this brainchild is fading and dying before his eyes. That's where the real disaster is. What am I getting at? The fact is that Alexei's family business has faced difficulties. The reasons were different, problems with loans or accounting errors. Alexei did not delve into these issues, but he felt sorry for his father, because the business was his brainchild. Of course, the family was not left without means of livelihood, but it no longer had the same strength and confidence. My father decided to move to Italy, where he had friends and a home. Alexei's older brother became involved in charity work, while the younger one remained idle. His father offered Alexei to move to Italy, but he refused. Although they no longer lived together with his wife Ludmila, he kept in touch with the children and helped them financially. There was also Nastya, who did not push Alexei away, but also did not get close to him. However, Alexei loved this girl so much that he missed her when he hadn't seen her for a long time. At first, after losing his job, Lyasha was at a loss. Where to go? What can he do? In fact, nothing. Then he thought about it. He knows how to build and drive a car. Maybe try yourself as a trucker? After all, he dreamed about it as a child. Dreaming? Yes. And now he has the opportunity to fulfill this dream, because there is nothing holding him back in this city. Nastya is currently away, she lives in the country only in the summer, and the rest of the time travels around the country, collecting material for her blog. And Lyaisha decided to try his hand at truckers. This is the right decision, his father approved of his choice. I also dreamed about it as a child, but then I got lost in everyday worries and forgot about my dream. Alexei got a job at a transport company as a heavy-duty truck driver and set off on a journey across the expanses of Russia. At first, he was very nervous, but over time he got used to it and started working normally. During his time as a trucker, he traveled almost the entire country. Maybe not all of it, but I've visited a lot of places. The earnings were good, not the same as in his father's business, but sufficient for a comfortable life in his vast and mysterious country. Everything would have been fine if it hadn't been for that terrible accident in which several heavy trucks collided. Alexei wasn't to blame, he was just unlucky. But he was still alive, and that was a good thing. The injuries were serious, and he spent 3 days in a coma, but he regained consciousness and began to recover. By that time, Ludmila had already found another man and had never visited Alexei in the hospital. Most of all, she was worried about the issue of alimony, but Alexei had savings, and he continued to pay without delay, which calmed her down. Nastya returned to the country after traveling around Russia. She knew Alexei had been in an accident, but she didn't think it was that serious. After the hospital, Alexei was unable to walk. He was now using a wheelchair. The doctors did not lose hope for recovery, but something went wrong, and Alexei decided to leave for the country. He was glad that he had taken care of the comfort of the cottage in advance. He laid tiles on which it was convenient to move around in a wheelchair. He crawled between the beds, but it did not give noticeable results. One day Nastya called. "Lyaisha, I've been back for a long time and I see that your car is here, but you don't come in," she said. "Are you arrogant or have you found someone else?" "I can't come, Nastya," he sighed. "Have you forgotten how?" She laughed. "Yeah," he replied, and hung up. I couldn't utter a word, I felt ashamed and hurt, a lump came up to my throat, and all the words seemed to be crushed by it. "Have you seen Lyaisha?" Nastya's neighbor shouted from the garden. "Now he only uses a wheelchair, he's done riding. And he even crawls around the cottage on his stomach." Nastya felt as if she had been electrocuted. "She's so stupid. Have you forgotten how?" She scolded herself. "Well, we must go to him." After all, after Ignat, he was the only man she cared about. Maybe after seeing him in a wheelchair, she would finally let go of the situation? Gathering up her courage, Nastya picked a bouquet of spring flowers and went to visit Lyaisha. "Oh, I'm here!" she shouted through the gate. But he sat in his chair and didn't move. "Lesh, are you alive?" She was frightened and rushed to him, bent over him, and then knelt down. "Alive, alive," he muttered and suddenly smiled. "I'm so glad to see you. Do you want to go for a ride?" "Of course I do," she echoed his carefree tone. He actually rolled her around in his chair, sitting her on his lap. They even laughed. "Do you still love me?" Nastya asked. "With all my heart and soul, but I haven't checked the rest of my body yet," he winked. It wasn't easy for them to keep up this seemingly casual conversation. Alexei had long ago made a wooden deck on the steps and now he famously rode into the house on his chair. Nastya was even surprised that such a thing was possible. And then, yes, Alexei had everything working as it should. The only problem was that he had to put up with problems related to his wobbly legs. "Lyaisha, let's go in for sports and swim every day, maybe you can still walk," Nastya suggested. I'll do my best, just promise me that you'll marry me if I start walking, he replied readily. That's a sly guy. Nastya shook her head. Okay, I promise. After that summer, Alexei was still able to walk. And Nastya kept her promise and married him. But before that, there were 3 months of exhausting training, several trips to places of power and to some kind of healers. Nastya had already lost one loved one, but she held on to Alexei tightly and did not let him disappear.